Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today we embark on an extraordinary, comprehensive journey through time, meticulously tracing the remarkable evolution of a nation that has profoundly reshaped our global landscape and redefined the very contours of the 21st century. Our topic is the rise of China, from Mao Zedong to modern economic power. An in-depth exploration of the monumental internal and external transformations that have propelled this ancient civilization onto the world stage as an undeniable and increasingly dominant force. We'll precisely delve into the ideological foundations laid by its revolutionary leader, navigate the tumultuous, often chaotic and frequently tragic periods of social upheaval, witness the breathtaking and unprecedented economic reforms that lifted hundreds of millions from abject poverty in a single generation, and finally critically examine China's current complex position as a global superpower, grappling with both immense opportunities and significant, intricate domestic and international challenges. This is not merely a historical account or a simple timeline. It is a captivating and multi-layered story of unparalleled resilience, audacious ambition, strategic foresight, and an unwavering long-term pursuit of national rejuvenation. A narrative filled with pivotal, world-altering moments that have reverberated across continents and continue to shape our collective future in profound ways. Before we dive deep into this fascinating and complex history, I'd be genuinely delighted to hear from all of you in the comments below. How is your day unfolding so far, wherever you are watching from? And on a more personal note, what is one significant, meaningful goal you are striving to achieve in your future, big or small? Let's share our aspirations, connect beyond the screen, and build a vibrant, supportive community right here. And if you find substantial value in this comprehensive and detailed exploration, the historical insights shared, and the effort put into this video, please consider hitting that subscribe button and joining our growing community. Your engagement, feedback, and support are truly invaluable and help this channel continue to produce in-depth, well-researched content like this for all of you. Our extensive story begins in 1949, a year indelibly etched into the annals of Chinese history as a true, decisive turning point after more than 2 decades of civil conflict. Following more than a century of foreign encroachment, beginning with the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century and continuing through periods of unequal treaties, territorial concessions, and invasion, alongside profound internal disunity and relentless warfare, the People's Republic of China was officially proclaimed by Mao Zedong from atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing's iconic Tiananmen Square on October 1st. This momentous declaration marked the triumphant culmination of a protracted and bloody struggle between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party that began in the 1920s. Signaling the definitive end of the nationalist Kuomintang government's rule on the Chinese mainland and the establishment of a new unified socialist state under the undisputed and centralized leadership of the Communist Party of China. The nationalist forces, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, retreated with their remaining troops and supporters to the island of Taiwan, establishing the Republic of China there, a political division of the Chinese state that persists to this day and remains a core unresolved issue. The newly formed PRC, utterly exhausted by decades of incessant conflict, widespread economic devastation, and profound poverty that afflicted the vast majority of its population, faced the daunting and monumental task of rebuilding a fractured nation from the ground up. Its vast population, numbering over 500 million people, was overwhelmingly agrarian, mostly illiterate, and lacked even basic health care access. Its industrial base was minimal and largely concentrated in a few coastal areas, and the formerly Japanese-occupied region of Manchuria and its infrastructure including transportation and communication networks, lay in ruins from decades of bombing and fighting. The vision articulated by Chairman Mao and the Communist Party was one of profound national liberation from foreign domination and imperialist influence, absolute self-reliance, and independence, a reaction to past dependence and anticipated future, international isolation, and a radical comprehensive transformation of Chinese society from its deep-seated roots. This included aiming to eradicate the entrenched vestiges of feudalism in the countryside, eliminate all forms of perceived foreign exploitation and influence, and forge a truly independent, unified, and powerful modern state capable of standing tall on the world stage and regaining its historical stature. This was not merely a change in political leadership or regime. It was envisioned as a fundamental reordering of society from its very foundations, promising a new dawn of equality and strength for a long-suffering people, and a complete, decisive break from the perceived weakness and humiliation of the past. The initial years of the People's Republic of China, stretching through the early to mid-1950s, were characterized by a series of fundamental reforms meticulously designed to consolidate communist control across the vast and diverse territory and lay the essential ideological and economic groundwork for a socialist societal structure based on Marxist-Leninist principles, adapted through Mao Zedong thought to the specific conditions of China, which was primarily a peasant society rather than an industrial proletariat one. Land reform stood paramount among these initiatives, representing a truly revolutionary undertaking that systematically confiscated land from wealthy landlords and richer peasants and redistributed it to millions of impoverished peasants who had toiled for generations with little to call their own. This drastic measure, implemented through mass campaigns often involving public struggle sessions where former landowners were denounced, tried by peasant tribunals, and often subjected to violence or execution, aimed to decisively dismantle the traditional rural power structure, which had for centuries been the bedrock of local authority, economic inequality, and social hierarchy. By empowering the vast peasant population who had formed the backbone of the Communist Revolution's military support, the party sought to secure their unwavering loyalty and build a new social order in the countryside based on class solidarity. Simultaneously, the new government moved decisively to nationalize key industries, steel, coal, textiles, etc., major banks, and vital transportation and communication networks, railways, ports, telecommunications, bringing the commanding heights of the nascent economy under direct state control and effectively eliminating private ownership of large-scale means of production. This move was intended to eliminate private capital accumulation, direct resources according to centralized economic planning, and ensure that all economic activity served the broader political and social goals of the socialist state rather than individual profit. Internationally, China adopted a clear and unequivocal policy of leaning to one side, firmly aligning itself with the newly formed socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union, signing the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. In 1950, seeking ideological guidance, essential economic aid, and military assistance from its communist ally while viewing the capitalist West, particularly the United States, with deep suspicion as imperialist adversaries actively seeking to undermine the new regime. An immediate and formidable external challenge arose with the sudden outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, just months after the PRC's founding and while it was still consolidating power and rebuilding. The conflict on the Korean Peninsula escalated rapidly when United Nations forces, primarily American, but including contingents from many nations, advanced towards China's border with North Korea along the Yalu River after pushing back North Korean forces. China's intervention, entering the war in October 1950, with the stated aim of protecting its border and supporting its communist ally North Korea against perceived American aggression, involved deploying hundreds of thousands of Chinese people's volunteers and was a strategically significant and incredibly costly decision, inflicting immense human and economic suffering on the nascent nation, which was still reeling from decades of war. While it came at a tremendous price in terms of lives lost, estimates vary widely, but are in the hundreds of thousands, potentially over 1 million casualties, and resources expended that could have been used for reconstruction, it solidified the party's image domestically as a fierce defender of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, particularly against perceived Western imperialist aggression near its borders. It also demonstrated China's unwavering willingness to confront external threats and stand up to a technologically and industrially superior adversary like the United States, earning it respect among some developing nations and strengthening its ties with the Soviet Union. Domestically, the war fostered a powerful sense of national unity, allowed the party to launch widespread and intense Resist America, Aid Korea propaganda campaigns to mobilize popular support, suppress any lingering pro-Western sentiment, and further consolidate its authority under the pervasive guise of national security, patriotic fervor, and the need for total unity in the face of external threat. This period also saw the implementation of extensive campaigns against counter-revolutionaries, bandits, and corrupt elements within society, further cementing the party's iron grip on power and eliminating potential opposition elements, often through mass mobilization, public trials, and executions during a climate of wartime urgency. Following the cessation of hostilities in Korea with the armistice signed in July 1953, allowing for a fragile peace on the peninsula, China embarked on its first 5-year plan, spanning from 1953 to 1957. This ambitious economic blueprint for rapid industrialization was largely modeled on the Soviet Union's highly centralized command economy, reflecting the close ideological and strategic alliance between the two communist giants at the time and the perceived success of the Soviet industrialization model in transforming an agrarian society into an industrial power in a relatively short period. The primary focus of the plan was on the rapid development of heavy industry, deemed essential for building national power, strengthening national defense, and achieving future economic independence from capitalist nations. This was facilitated by substantial Soviet aid, technical expertise, and machinery flowing into China, enabling the construction or renovation of 156 key industrial projects with Soviet assistance, forming the backbone of China's early modern industrial capacity. New factories, particularly in steel, like the expansion of the Anshan Iron and Steel Complex, and the construction of new ones in Wuhan and Baotou, coal mining, machinery production, energy generation, hydroelectric and thermal power plants, and chemical industries were constructed across the country, often in inland areas for strategic dispersal away from vulnerable coastal regions. Major infrastructure projects, including railways, connecting previously isolated regions and facilitating resource transport, like the Baoji-Chengdu line, bridges, like the first major railway bridge across the Yangtze River at Wuhan, and power plants were initiated to support industrial expansion and facilitate resource distribution. A centralized planning system, administered by the State Planning Commission, was meticulously implemented to direct every aspect of economic activity, from raw material allocation to production targets and final distribution through state-owned enterprises and supply and marketing cooperatives. This period saw impressive growth in industrial output, often exceeding planned targets, laying the foundational elements for China's future industrial base and creating a burgeoning urban working class, particularly in major cities that saw rapid population growth. However, the collectivization of agriculture, which began with the formation of mutual aid teams and lower-level cooperatives in the early 1950s, gradually became compulsory and more radical towards the end of the plan. Individual peasant land and resources were increasingly pooled into large collective farms, higher agricultural producers' cooperatives, intended to increase agricultural output through economies of scale, enable mechanization, and provide surplus. Grain to feed the growing urban industrial workforce and for export to pay for Soviet aid and industrial imports. Yet this move, by diminishing individual incentives, managerial flexibility at the local level, and autonomy for peasants, began to create early, subtle tensions within the rural economy, sowing the seeds for future agricultural challenges and discontent among the peasantry, as productivity often lagged behind expectations despite increased inputs, and central control over resources sometimes led to local shortages. As the first five-year plan concluded successfully in 1957, surpassing many targets, Mao Zedong became increasingly confident and impatient with the gradualist pace of development and began to advocate for a more rapid, ideologically driven approach, believing the revolutionary spirit of the masses could overcome material constraints. His vision for China began to diverge increasingly from the Soviet model, which he saw as becoming bureaucratic and losing revolutionary fervor. He grew impatient with the more measured approach advocated by some within his own party, such as Liu Xiaoqi and Zhou Enlai, who favored continued planning and technical expertise. He believed that China could achieve communism at a much faster, accelerated pace, bypassing certain stages of development that Marxists traditionally considered necessary by unleashing the boundless energy and enthusiasm of the mobilized masses. He also chafed under Soviet tutelage, viewing Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, his denunciation of the personality cult, which Mao saw as an indirect criticism of himself, and pursuit of peaceful coexistence with the West as revisionism, a betrayal of revolutionary principles, and a craven capitulation to imperialism. China criticized the Soviet Union for not supporting its territorial claims against India and for not sharing advanced nuclear weapons technology freely. Further, straining relations, this ideological divergence, coupled with a burgeoning sense of national pride after the first plan, the perceived success of mass mobilization campaigns in other areas, and a fervent desire for a uniquely Chinese path to socialism independent of Soviet influence, set the stage for one of the most ambitious, utopian, and ultimately devastating campaigns in modern history, the Great Leap Forward. Launched in 1958, this audacious campaign aimed to rapidly transform China from a predominantly agrarian society into a modern industrial power within a few years through unprecedented mass mobilization, utopian planning, and intense ideological fervor, famously attempting to walk on two legs by developing both industry and agriculture simultaneously and rapidly through mass campaigns rather than centralized planning and technical expertise. The core, almost fantastical idea was to simultaneously produce massive quantities of steel and grain in volumes that would ostensibly surpass even the most developed nations like Britain and the United States within a few years, based on unrealistic targets fueled by revolutionary optimism and falsified reports. Backyard furnaces, often rudimentary and inefficient kilns constructed from mud and brick, fueled by charcoal and scrap metal, including everyday items like cooking pots, tools, and even valuable historical artifacts, were set up across the entire country, involving tens of millions of people, encouraging everyone, including millions of peasants and urban residents, to produce steel by melting down metal, often resulting in unusable, low-quality pig iron that was worthless. Agricultural communes were expanded and consolidated, merging collective farms into much larger unwieldy units encompassing tens or even hundreds of thousands of people, where communal living, dining, child-rearing, and labor were organized on a massive scale, and private plots, which had provided a small but crucial source of food and income, were largely eliminated. Unrealistic, often wildly exaggerated targets for grain production were set based on ideologically driven optimism and frequently falsified reports from local officials eager to demonstrate their revolutionary zeal and avoid criticism or punishment, leading to the implementation of disastrous agricultural techniques dictated by ideology rather than science, such as impossibly close planting, sowing densely, deep plowing, damaging soil structure, and the extermination of sparrows, leading to insect infestations. The consequences of the Great Leap Forward were utterly catastrophic, leading to one of the deadliest man-made famines in human history, often referred to as the Great Chinese Famine or the 3 Years of Great Difficulty. The massive diversion of labor from essential farming activities to futile industrial projects like backyard steel production, combined with misguided agricultural practices dictated by ideology, severe environmental factors such as widespread droughts and devastating floods that hit crops already weakened by poor farming methods, and the systemic suppression of truthful information from local officials fearful of reporting failure, led to a monumental and widespread famine affecting nearly every corner of the country between 1959 and 1962. Cadres often seized grain from starving peasants to meet inflated state quotas for export or to store in communal canteens that quickly but ran out of food due to overconsumption and inflated records, exacerbating the crisis and leading to mass starvation. Estimates from various demographic studies and historical accounts suggest that tens of millions of people, likely between 15 and 55 million, perished from starvation, malnutrition, disease like edema and dysentery, and related causes during this period. This period witnessed widespread malnutrition, desperate measures for survival, eating bark, leaves, soil, and immense suffering across the Chinese countryside, with heartbreaking accounts of families starving together, and even reports of infanticide and cannibalism in some areas. The economic infrastructure was severely damaged. Industrial output plummeted as resources were misallocated and equipment was ruined in the Steel Campaign. And the Communist Party's credibility suffered a profound, though largely concealed, blow among the populace, particularly in the countryside. The full extent of the disaster was meticulously hidden from the outside world and even from many within China at the time, through strict censorship, pervasive propaganda blaming natural disasters and Soviet perfidy, and the silencing of dissent, even within party ranks, as seen with the severe criticism and subsequent purge of Defense Minister Peng Dehuai at the Lushan Plenum in 1959, after he submitted a private letter to Mao criticizing aspects of the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward represented a stark, tragic, and devastating failure of Mao's radical utopian vision and an indictment of the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism, forcing a period of painful readjustment, economic retrenchment, and a temporary, reluctant retreat from some of the more extreme utopian policies, with more pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and Chen Yun taking a leading role in implementing emergency measures and recovery efforts by allowing some private plots, free markets, and reducing the size of communes. The profound failures of the Great Leap Forward, coupled with increasingly sharp ideological differences and diverging national interests, significantly exacerbated the growing Sino-Soviet split, transforming it from a fraternal disagreement into an open and hostile rivalry. What began as a nuanced disagreement over the correct interpretation of Marxism-Leninism, the correct strategy for promoting world revolution, and the optimal path to achieving communism, with China advocating for peasant-based revolution in the developing world and the USSR focusing on the industrial proletariat and state-to-state relations, escalated into a full-blown geopolitical rivalry between the two largest communist states, vying for leadership of the global communist movement and influence in the Third World. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West, seeking détente, arms control, and avoiding nuclear confrontation, which Mao vehemently viewed as revisionism, a betrayal of revolutionary principles, a sign of weakness, and a craven capitulation to imperialism at the expense of supporting global communist movements. Mao also condemned Khrushchev's secret de-Stalinization speech at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, seeing it as an attack on the principle of strong, unquestionable leadership and a historical revision. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which Mao viewed as adventurism, followed by capitulation, and the Soviet Union's limited response to the Sino-Indian War in 1962. China criticized the Soviet Union for not supporting its territorial claims against India, for not sharing advanced nuclear weapons technology freely after initially promising to do so, and for withdrawing Soviet advisors and tearing up contracts in 1960. By the early 1960s, relations had deteriorated severely. Soviet advisors were abruptly withdrawn from China in 1960, leaving many half-finished industrial projects. Crucial economic and technical aid ceased entirely. The two communist giants engaged in increasingly hostile rhetorical exchanges, the 9 commentaries by the CCP criticizing the CPSU, competing for influence in communist parties and movements worldwide, and even engaged in symbolic and later actual military border skirmishes, most notably the serious Zhenbao Island, Damansky Island incident, on the Ussuri River in March 1969, which brought them to the brink of a large-scale military conflict and led to a significant Soviet military buildup along the lengthy Sino-Soviet border. This dramatic split left China in an unprecedented state of isolation on the global stage, surrounded by perceived hostile powers, the U.S. to the east, supporting Taiwan and its allies in Asia, the USSR to the north and west, with a massive military presence, and forced to rely even more heavily on its own limited resources and ingenuity for national survival and development, fostering a deep sense of self-reliance and nationalistic pride, famously encapsulated in the slogan, "Walking on 2 legs and preparing for potential invasion from either superpower." Despite this intense isolation and economic hardship following the Great Leap, China successfully developed and tested its own atomic bomb in October 1964 and detonated a hydrogen bomb in June 1967. A significant technological and strategic achievement, accomplished with minimal outside help, which further solidified its independent standing, provided a credible nuclear deterrent against both superpowers, and boosted national morale, demonstrating its determination to become a major military power, despite external pressures and internal difficulties. In the mid-1960s, as China was still recovering from the Great Leap Forward famine and navigating the Sino-Soviet split, Mao Zedong, increasingly convinced that the revolutionary fervor was diminishing among the populace, that capitalist rotors and revisionist tendencies were re-emerging within the Communist Party and society at large, seeing the pragmatic economic policies adopted after the Great Leap as a deviation from true socialism and a threat to his revolutionary legacy, and feeling his own power and influence waning after the Great Leap Forward's failure led to a period of reduced political prominence, initiated the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966 with the stated aim of purging bourgeois and revisionist elements from Chinese society, preventing capitalist restoration, and ensuring the ideological purity of communism as defined by Mao Zedong thought. It was in reality a complex and brutal power struggle orchestrated by Mao to reassert his absolute authority, bypass the established party bureaucracy that he felt was becoming rigid and unresponsive, eliminate perceived rivals, such as State Chairman Liu Shaoqi, once his designated successor, and Party General Secretary Deng Xiaoping, who had been instrumental in post-Great Leap recovery and were seen as less ideologically pure or too pragmatic, and reignite a sense of revolutionary zeal and absolute loyalty to himself among the masses, particularly the younger generation who had not experienced the Long March or the initial revolution. Students, often barely teenagers, were mobilized and organized into paramilitary groups known as Red Guards, armed with copies of Mao's Little Red Book, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, and encouraged to challenge all forms of authority, bombard the headquarters, Archjo, criticize old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, the four olds, and denounce anyone suspected of capitalist, anti-revolutionary, or traditional leanings through public struggle sessions, mass rallies, and wall posters, Dazabao. Cultural revolution plunged China into an abyss of unprecedented chaos, social upheaval, and widespread violence that lasted for a decade, from 1966 until Mao's death in 1976. Intellectuals, artists, teachers, doctors, scientists, former landlords, religious figures, anyone with foreign connections, and even high-ranking party officials and military leaders deemed insufficiently loyal or ideologically suspect were subjected to public humiliation, brutal torture, arbitrary imprisonment in makeshift jails, being sent to May 7th cadre schools for arduous labor and ideological re-education in the countryside, or outright execution in struggle sessions and waves of politically motivated violence and factional fighting. Ancient temples, pagodas, valuable historical artifacts, irreplaceable works of art, libraries, books deemed politically incorrect, and historical sites were systematically attacked and destroyed by Red Guards and other revolutionary rebels as symbols of the old feudal and bourgeois society, leading to an immense and irreparable loss of cultural heritage spanning thousands of years. Schools and universities across the nation were closed for several years, effectively halting formal education, academic research, and critical thinking for an entire generation, creating a lost generation whose formative years were consumed by revolutionary fervor, political study, and factional struggle rather than academic learning. The economy suffered significant disruptions as industrial and agricultural production ground to a halt in many areas due to political infighting, factional violence between rival Red Guard groups and later worker factions, and the breakdown of order, expertise, and centralized planning. Millions of urban youth, including many former Red Guards who had become a destabilizing force in the cities, were sent down to the countryside, known as the Up to the Mountains and Down to the Countryside movement, for re-education through arduous manual labor alongside peasants in remote areas, a process that often involved immense hardship, psychological trauma, separation from families, and a sense of wasted potential and disillusionment. The military, under the initial leadership of Defense Minister Lin Biao, who was elevated to Mao's officially designated successor in 1969, played an increasingly prominent role in attempting to maintain a semblance of order and supporting Mao's directives, eventually taking over administrative functions in many areas as civilian party and government structures collapsed. However, Lin Biao himself was later implicated in a suspected coup plot against Mao, and died in a mysterious plane crash in Mongolia in September 1971, while allegedly attempting to flee the country after his plot was discovered, further destabilizing the political landscape and leading to another round of purges and uncertainty. The movement created deep, lasting divisions and trauma within Chinese society, pitting families, friends, neighbors, and colleagues against each other in a climate of pervasive fear, paranoia, mutual suspicion, denunciation, and ideological extremism, where informing on others for perceived ideological impurities or lack of revolutionary zeal was common and often rewarded. This period left an indelible, painful scar on generations of Chinese people, representing a profound era of trauma, immense human suffering, lost potential, and irreparable cultural devastation, the full historical and social reckoning of which continues to be a sensitive and complex issue in China today, with the official historical assessment remaining cautious and emphasizing its mistakes while upholding Mao's overall legacy. Despite the profound internal turmoil, isolation, and ideological rigidity of the Cultural Revolution, the early 1970s saw a significant and unexpected shift in China's external relations that would fundamentally alter the global balance of power. In the latter stages of the Cold War, recognizing the strategic imperative of countering growing Soviet influence, which was now seen as the primary and more immediate military threat after the 1969 border clashes and the large Soviet troop buildup along the border, and seeking a new balance of power in the Cold War against Moscow, the United States, under the visionary and pragmatic leadership of President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, initiated a groundbreaking secret rapprochement with Beijing. The discreet visit by Henry Kissinger in July 1971, meticulously planned and executed via a diversion in Pakistan, was a stunning diplomatic maneuver that paved the way for President Nixon's historic and widely publicized trip to China in February 1972. This unprecedented diplomatic breakthrough, famously captured by iconic images of Nixon shaking hands with a frail but still formidable Mao Zedong and engaging in extensive high-level discussions with the experienced and pragmatic Premier Zhou Enlai, shattered decades of isolation and hostility between the two nations that had existed since the Korean War and the establishment of the PRC. It signaled a new era of engagement, albeit cautious, limited, and pragmatic initially, and fundamentally altered the global geopolitical landscape by creating a new triangular diplomacy that put immense diplomatic, economic, and strategic pressure on the Soviet Union by opening a channel between Washington and Beijing. During the visit, formalized in the Shanghai Communique, the United States acknowledged the One China policy, recognizing the PRC's position that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China, without explicitly endorsing Beijing's claim over the island or abandoning its informal relationship with Taiwan, a crucial diplomatic ambiguity that allowed for progress. This paved the way for the eventual normalization of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and PRC in 1979. Shortly before Nixon's visit in October 1971, the People's Republic of China finally gained its rightful seat in the United Nations General Assembly and, crucially, its permanent seat on the Security Council, replacing the delegation from the Republic of China, Taiwan, with widespread support from newly independent developing nations and some Western countries recognizing the demographic and political reality of the PRC. This marked China's dramatic re-entry into the international community after more than 2 decades of being largely ostracized by the Western Bloc and excluded from the UN, signifying its growing global stature and diplomatic importance, and effectively ending the diplomatic isolation imposed since the Korean War. This period, also, saw China establishing diplomatic relations with many other countries, expanding its network of international ties. The death of the aging Premier Zhou Enlai in January 1976, followed by the death of Mao Zedong himself in September 1976, brought a definitive end to an era defined by revolutionary fervor, relentless ideological campaigns, and immense social upheaval. Mao's passing, in particular, left a profound power vacuum and ignited a fierce, immediate, but relatively brief struggle for leadership within the top echelons of the Communist Party. The Gang of Four, a radical faction composed of Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, and 3 other key figures from the Cultural Revolution, Zhang Junqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, who controlled key propaganda outlets and held influential positions, attempted to seize power and continue the extreme, ultra-leftist policies of the Cultural Revolution, fearing that more pragmatic leaders would dismantle their power base, reverse their policies, and repudiate Mao's later legacy. They sought to prevent the rise of more moderate or pragmatic leaders and maintain the revolutionary purity advocated by Mao in his later years. However, they were swiftly arrested just weeks after Mao's death in October 1976 by a coalition of veteran party leaders including Marshal Ye Jianying, Vice Premier Li Xiannian, and the designated successor chosen by Mao, Hua Guofeng, who coined and adhered to the slogan, "Two whatevers," vowing to resolutely uphold whatever policy decisions Mao made and adhere to whatever instructions Mao gave, signaling a decisive, though initially hesitant, shift away from the radicalism that had characterized the previous decade. This pivotal moment, often referred to as the end of the Cultural Revolution and the beginning of a new era, opened the door for Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatic, resilient, highly experienced, and well-connected leader who had been purged twice during the Cultural Revolution for his capitalist road tendencies and pragmatic economic views, to gradually but decisively re-emerge onto the political scene. Through skillful political maneuvering, forming alliances with other veteran leaders who favored stability and development, and gradually undermining Hua Guofeng's authority, Deng consolidated his position. His political rehabilitation and eventual ascendancy were a testament to his shrewd political acumen, his long-standing relationships and network within the party and military, and the overwhelming desire within the party leadership, military and among the populace, for stability, order, and, crucially, economic development after years of chaos, ideological struggle, and stagnation that had left China far behind the rest of East Asia and the developed world. By the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in December 1978, Deng Xiaoping had effectively become the paramount leader, shifting the party's focus from class struggle to economic construction. Deng Xiaoping's full rise to power was a process, not an event, requiring careful political maneuvering to outmaneuver rivals like Hua Guofeng and establish his policy line. But by the pivotal third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in December 1978, which is often seen as the formal beginning of the reform era, Deng had consolidated his position, gaining control of the party and military through key appointments and policy endorsements, and officially initiated a series of transformative policies known collectively as reform and opening up. Gage Kaifang. This period marked a radical and fundamental reorientation of China's development strategy, moving away from the Soviet-inspired command economy and Maoist self-reliance. Deng famously articulated his pragmatic philosophy and justification for these changes with the adage, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." This simple yet profound statement underscored his prioritization of tangible economic development and practical results, catching mice or generating wealth, increasing productivity, and improving living standards, over rigid adherence to ideological dogma, a radical departure from Maoist principles, and a clear signal of a new direction focused on modernization. He acutely recognized that China's economy was stagnant, inefficient, technologically backward, and that the country was falling, dangerously far behind the developed world and even its East Asian neighbors who had industrialized rapidly. His overarching vision was to modernize China's economy, military, science and technology, and agriculture, the four modernizations, by gradually introducing market mechanisms, decentralizing economic decision-making to some extent, allowing for greater individual initiative, and crucially integrating with the global economy to attract capital, technology, and expertise, all while meticulously maintaining the Communist Party's absolute political control and ensuring social stability, which he viewed as essential preconditions for development. This was a truly revolutionary departure from the past, representing a profound and irreversible shift in the nation's trajectory, moving away from continuous class struggle towards economic construction and national prosperity as the primary focus and the new source of the party's legitimacy. He famously stated, in stark contrast to Maoist egalitarianism, "To get rich is glorious," explicitly encouraging individual initiative, entrepreneurship, and wealth creation as positive contributions to national development, unleashing the pent-up energy of the population. The initial and arguably most crucial phase of Deng's reforms focused squarely on agriculture, the sector employing the vast majority of China's population and the source of its most acute poverty and past famines that had caused so much suffering. The highly inefficient and demotivating collective farming system, which had stifled productivity for decades by removing individual incentives and binding peasants to rigid work units, was systematically dismantled and replaced, primarily through bottom-up initiatives that were later endorsed by the innovative household responsibility system. Under this ingenious arrangement, ownership of land technically remained with the collective, or the state, but individual peasant households were allocated specific plots of collective land to farm under long-term leases, initially around 15 years, later extended to 30 years or even longer, to provide greater security and incentive for investment. Crucially, households were allowed to keep and sell any surplus produce, anything grown beyond a set quota or tax obligation to the state, on newly permitted free markets at market prices, providing a powerful, direct economic incentive for increased production, hard work, and personal gain. This simple yet revolutionary change, empowering individual households to manage their own labor and land, unleashed the long-suppressed productive potential of millions of farmers, leading to a dramatic and immediate increase in agricultural output in the early 1980s, significantly improving food security across the nation, diversifying rural incomes beyond basic grain production, and effectively ending the specter of widespread famine that had haunted China for decades. Farmers, now with a direct, tangible stake in their labor and land, worked harder, invested more in their plots, fertilizers, tools, and managed their resources more efficiently than under collective farming, fundamentally transforming the rural economy and generating capital that would later fuel the growth of the rural industries, township and village enterprises, or TVEs, and urban development. This success in agriculture also laid the crucial groundwork for broader economic reforms by demonstrating the power of incentives and market forces, albeit limited ones initially and operating within a state-controlled framework, even within a socialist system, providing political justification for further liberalization. Simultaneously with the agricultural reforms, Deng Xiaoping championed the bold creation of special economic zones, or SEZs, strategically located along China's southeastern coast, particularly near the vibrant capitalist economies of Hong Kong and Macau, which were then under British and Portuguese administration respectively, providing direct access to international trade networks, capital markets, and business expertise. Shenzhen, a small, sleepy fishing village bordering Hong Kong with deep-water access and easy proximity to international shipping routes, was designated as the very first SEZ in 1980, followed shortly by Zhuhai, Xiamen, and Shantou in Guangdong, and Fujian provinces. Hainan Island later became the largest SEZ in 1988. These zones were meticulously designed as experimental laboratories for market-oriented reforms and integration with the global economy, operating under more liberal economic policies and administrative flexibility than the rest of the country. They offered highly preferential policies to attract vital foreign investment, advanced technology, and modern management expertise that China desperately lacked after years of isolation. Foreign companies, especially from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, which benefited from cultural and linguistic ties as well as geographical proximity, were actively encouraged to set up factories and operations within these zones, enjoying significant tax breaks, simplified customs procedures, relaxed regulatory frameworks compared to the interior, access to a vast, inexpensive, and disciplined labor force migrating from the interior, and the crucial ability to repatriate profits. The SEZs rapidly became dynamic engines of economic growth, initially focused on export-oriented light manufacturing, demonstrating the viability and success of market principles and integration with the global capitalist system within a socialist framework. They served as crucial models for further reforms across the entire country, acting as a bridge for integrating China into the global economy and kickstarting its unprecedented export-oriented manufacturing boom, transforming the coastal regions into vibrant industrial hubs, magnets for internal migration, and showcases for China's new direction. Their undeniable economic success, characterized by booming trade, rapid urbanization, and visible improvements in living standards within the zones, gradually overcame initial skepticism and ideological resistance from party conservatives who feared spiritual pollution from capitalism, proving that foreign capital and market forces could be harnessed to serve the goal of socialist modernization and national wealth accumulation. The reforms gradually extended beyond agriculture and the initial special economic zones, reaching into the heart of the urban economy, specifically targeting the notoriously inefficient state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and actively nurturing the nascent private sector. SOEs, which dominated the urban industrial and service sectors and were long plagued by chronic inefficiency, overstaffing due to the iron rice bowl system, which guaranteed lifetime employment, housing, healthcare, pensions, and social welfare, lack of innovation, and lack of market responsiveness, were gradually given greater operational autonomy. They were encouraged to operate on commercial principles, to be accountable for their profits and losses, moving away from direct state subsidies, and were allowed to retain a portion of their earnings for reinvestment and employee bonuses linked to performance, introducing a basic level of incentive. While full-scale privatization of the largest strategic SOEs in sectors like energy, telecommunications, heavy industry, and finance was largely avoided initially, the gradual introduction of market competition, both from the growing private sector domestically and foreign companies operating in China or importing goods, forced many state-owned entities to become more competitive, streamline operations, reduce redundant workers, or face the threat of closure, bankruptcy, or merger. Crucially, the government also began to cautiously permit and even actively encourage the growth of private businesses, initially small-scale individual and household enterprises, gerihu, in services and retail, later expanding to larger privately owned companies, xingque, in manufacturing, trade, and eventually technology. This burgeoning private sector, initially viewed with deep suspicion as a potential threat to the socialist system and labeled as a capitalist tail that might need to be cut, quickly became a dynamic and increasingly vital force in the economy, creating millions of jobs, fostering innovation, driving competition, and contributing significantly to the nation's economic vitality, diversification, and tax revenues, particularly in light manufacturing, consumer goods, services, and later, the digital economy. The iron rice bowl system gradually began to erode as market forces and competition took hold, leading to a more flexible, but also less secure labor market, with tens of millions of workers laid off from inefficient SOEs in the 1990s during a major restructuring phase, creating new social challenges and a need for social safety nets. The private sector's contribution to GDP and employment steadily grew, eventually surpassing that of the state sector in many areas. The open-door policy was an absolutely critical and transformative component of Deng's comprehensive reforms, actively encouraging foreign trade, attracting foreign direct investment, and promoting international exchange in an unprecedented manner after decades of relative isolation and self-reliance. China began to enthusiastically welcome foreign capital, cutting-edge technology, and modern management expertise from abroad, recognizing that these were absolutely essential catalysts for its ambitious modernization drive across industry, agriculture, defense and science and technology, the four modernizations. This marked a fundamental shift from the Maoist suspicion of foreign influence and reliance solely on domestic resources. Joint ventures between Chinese enterprises, both state-owned and increasingly private, and foreign companies became increasingly common, facilitating the rapid transfer of crucial knowledge, advanced production techniques, and access to global markets and distribution networks that Chinese companies lacked. Foreign direct investment, FDI, poured into China, initially into the SEZs and coastal regions, attracted by low labor costs, a large domestic market, and preferential policies. Chinese goods, particularly labor-intensive products like textiles, apparel, toys, footwear, furniture, and light manufactured electronics, began to flood global markets at competitive prices, leveraging the country's immense competitive advantage in labor costs, growing production capacity, and improving logistics. This outward-looking approach fundamentally transformed China from a largely isolated, autarkic planned economy into a major, indispensable player in international trade and investment, becoming a central node in global production networks. It laid the crucial groundwork for its future role as the world's factory, deeply embedding China into global supply chains, attracting massive inflows of foreign direct investment, FDI, and becoming a preferred destination for manufacturing for multinational corporations seeking efficiency. This policy also led to the rapid expansion of China's diplomatic relations with countries worldwide, increasing its global footprint, joining international organizations, and sending students and scholars abroad for study, fostering greater international interaction and learning. The sweeping economic reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping brought about profound, rapid, and often uneven social changes across the vast Chinese landscape, dramatically altering the lives of hundreds of millions of people and reshaping the very fabric of society. Driven by the promise of better economic opportunities, higher wages, and access to a wider variety of goods and services in urban areas, alongside limited opportunities in the countryside, after initial agricultural gains, millions of people migrated from impoverished rural areas to the burgeoning coastal cities and other urban centers in what became the largest human migration in history. This unprecedented and rapid urbanization on a scale never before seen created immense pressure on urban infrastructure, housing, and social services, leading to the rapid construction of massive new urban areas and the creation of a large, often transient migrant worker population, Nongmingong, who performed essential labor but often faced social exclusion, discrimination, and limited access to basic public goods like education for their children and health care in cities due to the restrictive hukou household registration system that tied social welfare benefits to one's place of origin. A new dynamic class of entrepreneurs, private business owners, managers, professionals, and urban consumers emerged, forming a burgeoning middle class and an elite wealthy class eager to embrace the increasing availability of diverse goods and services, from consumer electronics and household appliances to fashion, automobiles, international travel, and private education. Living standards improved dramatically for a significant portion of the population, particularly in urban and coastal areas, with access to better housing, more varied and abundant food options, ending scarcity for many, and a wider array of consumer goods, fundamentally altering daily life, aspirations, and social values, shifting focus towards material prosperity, individual success, and consumerism after decades of collectivist ideology. However, these rapid and uneven changes also brought new and complex challenges that the state struggled to manage. a growing and visible income inequality between the prosperous urban and coastal areas and the lagging rural and inland regions, and between different social groups, creating significant social disparities and a sense of unfairness. Environmental degradation escalated dramatically and reached crisis levels due to unchecked industrial growth, heavy reliance on coal for energy, the primary energy source fueling economic growth, and lax environmental regulations and enforcement in the pursuit of growth, leading to severe air pollution, smog blanketing major cities causing significant public health problems, widespread water scarcity and contamination in major rivers and lakes, soil degradation and desertification, and resource depletion impacting public health, agricultural productivity, and the overall quality of life in many areas, becoming a major source of public discontent. Furthermore, rising corruption, fueled by rapid economic growth, vast discretionary power wielded by officials in a less transparent system, and the blurring lines between state power and market opportunities, rent-seeking, became endemic at all levels of government and within state-owned enterprises, undermining public trust in government institutions, creating a pervasive sense of unfairness and injustice, and becoming a major source of public discontent and social unrest, manifesting in thousands of mass incidents or protests annually over issues like illegal land seizures by local officials for development, pollution from factories, and labor disputes over unpaid wages or poor working conditions. The rural-urban divide persisted, with millions of migrant workers facing systemic challenges related to social services, housing, often living in precarious urban villages, labor rights, facing exploitation, and full integration into city life, often lacking proper hukou status and facing discrimination. The one-child policy, introduced in 1979 to control population growth and conserve resources, also began to have profound and complex demographic consequences, leading to an increasingly aging population with a shrinking base of young people, a shrinking future workforce relative to the number of retirees, and a severely skewed gender ratio with significantly more males than females, due to a cultural preference for sons and sex-selective abortions, posing long-term challenges for social welfare systems, health care, economic growth, and social stability, marriage prospects for males. Despite the extensive and successful economic liberalization and the dramatic improvements in living standards for many, the Communist Party maintained an unyielding firm grip on political power, viewing any organized challenge to its monopoly on power, ideological control, or authority as a fundamental existential threat to national stability and its own survival. The deliberate lack of corresponding political reforms, such as greater democratic participation, freedom of association, freedom of the press, an independent judiciary, or protection of civil liberties, led to growing tensions and discontent, particularly among students, intellectuals, and urban residents who had been exposed to Western ideas of democracy, human rights, and freedom of expression through the opening up process and sought greater freedoms, political participation, and accountability from the government, particularly concerning corruption and lack of transparency. These simmering frustrations, exacerbated by rising inflation in the late 1980s, perceived rampant corruption among officials and their families, benefiting unfairly from the reforms, official profiteering, and a desire for greater political openness and freedom of expression, culminated in the widespread student-led Tiananmen Square protests of spring 1989, which gained broad support from other segments of urban society. Students initially leading the movement with demands for dialogue with the government, democracy, freedom of the press, and an end to corruption, occupied Tiananmen Square for weeks, conducting hunger strikes and attracting international media attention. They were soon joined by workers, intellectuals, and other citizens in Beijing, and supported by protests in other major cities across the nation. The protests initially met with a degree of hesitant tolerance and intense internal party debate, about how to respond, with some leaders like Zhao Ziyang advocating for dialogue, eventually escalated as protesters refused to disperse and the government's patience wore thin amidst concerns of the movement spreading beyond control and fundamentally challenging party authority. This led to the declaration of martial law in parts of Beijing and a tragic and brutal crackdown by the military, the People's Liberation Army, on the night of June 3rd and early morning of June 4th, ordered by hardline elements within the party leadership. The use of overwhelming force, including tanks and armed troops, firing indiscriminately on unarmed civilians in and around Tiananmen Square and on the approaches to the city center, to suppress the demonstrations, resulted in an unknown but significant number of casualties, both dead and injured, among protesters, bystanders, and residents, with estimates ranging from hundreds to thousands. This brutal suppression drew widespread international condemnation from Western governments, human rights organizations, and the global public, leading to economic sanctions like arms embargoes and restrictions on high-level contacts, and a temporary but severe chill in China's relations with Western countries, and a significant setback to its international image. The Tiananmen incident served as a stark and painful reminder, both domestically and internationally, that while economic reforms were enthusiastically embraced as essential for national strength and legitimacy, political liberalization was definitively not on the party's agenda, and any form of organized dissent challenging party rule would be met with overwhelming force, prioritizing stability and party control above all else, even at a high human cost and severe international reputational damage. The party leadership concluded that political reform must be kept separate from economic reform and that maintaining control was paramount. The immediate aftermath of the Tiananmen Square crackdown saw a period of political conservatism and a noticeable slowdown in the pace and boldness of economic reform as hardliners within the party gained temporary ascendancy, purged reformers like Zhao Ziyang, and questioned the direction and speed of opening up, fearing that market forces and foreign influence were inevitably leading to demands for political liberalization and instability. There was a brief period of economic retrenchment and a renewed emphasis on ideological purity and state planning. However, Deng Xiaoping, despite having officially retired from all formal positions and not holding a top title, remained the ultimate arbiter of power and understood that continued rapid economic growth was essential for the party's long-term legitimacy and ability to maintain stability after the trauma of 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern European communist regimes, which he attributed partly to their economic failures and lack of reform. To counter the conservative backlash and reignite the reform momentum, he undertook his famous Southern Tour in early 1992, a pivotal and strategically significant journey to the booming special economic zones and cities in the South, including Shenzhen and Shanghai, which had continued to experience rapid growth despite the political climate. During this highly publicized trip, widely covered by state media, he met with local officials and emphatically reiterated his unwavering commitment to economic reform and opening up, urging party officials across the country to accelerate the pace of market-oriented changes, deepen reforms, embrace foreign investment, and seize the opportunity for rapid growth. He pointed to the success of the SEZs as proof of the correctness of the reform path. He specifically warned against leftist ideological obstruction that could stifle growth, famously declaring that development is the hard truth, Fajan Shi Ying Daoli, and that the primary task of the party was to focus on economic construction. This tour was a crucial turning point, effectively overcoming the conservative backlash, re-energizing the reform process across the nation, dispelling lingering doubts about China's future economic direction, and firmly reaffirming the party's unwavering focus on economic development as the central task and the source of its legitimacy and popular support. It signaled that the pragmatic course of market-oriented reform and opening up would continue and indeed accelerate, providing a powerful impetus for the next phase of rapid growth and deeper integration into the global economy, which would dramatically transform China in the subsequent 2 decades. The 1990s, under the leadership of Jiang Zemin, who was elevated to succeed Zhao Ziyang as party's general secretary after Tiananmen and later became state president in 1993, saw the continuation and significant deepening of economic reforms, guided by the imperative to maintain high growth rates to absorb the large labor force, fund social programs, and prevent instability. Jiang Zemin, along with his capable and reform-minded Premier Zhu Rongji, who took office in 1998, oversaw a period of rapid institutional change, large-scale marketization, and often painful restructuring of the inefficient state sector. The concept of a socialist market economy was formally enshrined in the party constitution in 1992 at the 14th Party Congress, replacing the term socialist planned commodity economy, and then in the state constitution in 1993, officially acknowledging the indispensable role of market forces, supply and demand, private property, which was later explicitly protected in the Constitution in 2004, and international trade within a socialist framework, providing a theoretical and legal justification for further, more aggressive reforms and integration with the global economy. State-owned enterprises, SOEs, underwent extensive and often painful restructuring under the policy of grasping the big, letting go of the small, Zhuara Fangxiao, where the largest strategic SOEs were reformed, introducing corporate governance structures, listing on stock exchanges, but kept under state control and often consolidated, while millions of smaller and less efficient ones were privatized, merged, sold off, or forced into bankruptcy, leading to massive layoffs, known as Xiagang, laid off, impacting tens of millions of urban workers in the mid to late 1990s, disrupting the social contract but increasing efficiency and competitiveness in the remaining state sector. A robust and increasingly dynamic private sector flourished, growing rapidly and becoming a major engine of growth, innovation, employment, especially for laid-off SOE workers and rural migrants, and a significant source of tax revenues, especially in light manufacturing, consumer goods, services, and eventually the burgeoning internet and technology sectors. China actively pursued deeper and broader integration into the global trading system, culminating in its momentous and arduous accession to the World Trade Organization, WTO, in December 2001. After 15 years of complex negotiations and significant commitments to open its markets, reduce tariffs, average tariff rates drop significantly, eliminate non-tariff barriers, and adhere to international trade rules and norms regarding intellectual property rights and market access. This was a watershed moment that fundamentally changed China's relationship with the global economy. WTO membership provided China with unprecedented and guaranteed access to global markets, accelerated its transformation into the world's factory, attracted massive inflows of foreign direct investment, FDI, as multinational companies moved production to China to leverage lower costs and access the domestic market, and cemented its crucial role as a central link in complex global supply chains, fundamentally reshaping international trade patterns and global manufacturing locations. The early 2000s, under the leadership of Jiang Zemin and later Hu Jintao, who became Party General Secretary in 2002 and State President in 2003, witnessed an unprecedented, sustained, and truly extraordinary economic boom that propelled China into the ranks of the world's largest economies. Often referred to as China's golden age of growth, this period saw the country achieve average annual gross domestic product, GDP, growth rates consistently hovering around double digits for over a decade, often exceeding 10%, making it by far the fastest-growing major economy in the world and dramatically increasing its share of global GDP and international trade. Its manufacturing sector exploded in scale, sophistication, and output, producing an astonishing array of goods, from basic consumer items to advanced electronics, machinery, automobiles, and complex components for both export and a rapidly growing domestic market, solidifying its position as the world's leading exporter and manufacturing hub. Massive infrastructure projects, funded by extensive state investment and local government borrowing, were undertaken on an unparalleled scale, including the construction of the world's most extensive high-speed rail network, connecting major cities and spanning over 40,000 kilometers by the late 2010s, far exceeding the rest of the world combined. Numerous modern airports, hundreds built or expanded across the country, vast port facilities. China is home to many of the world's busiest container ports, facilitating global trade, and an extensive network of modern highways, transforming the country's physical landscape and dramatically facilitating internal trade, logistics, and connectivity, reducing transportation costs, and enabling the rapid flow of goods, services, and people. Iconic projects like the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, the world's largest power station, completed in 2006, symbolized China's engineering prowess and its ability to undertake colossal projects to harness resources for development. Urbanization continued at an astonishing pace, with new megacities emerging and existing ones expanding dramatically through the absorption of surrounding rural land and the influx of hundreds of millions of rural migrants, driving a massive construction boom in residential, commercial, and industrial properties. China became an insatiable consumer of raw materials, iron ore, oil, copper, coal, etc., driving global commodity prices to record highs and forging new, often resource for infrastructure relationships with resource-rich nations in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Central Asia through massive investments, loans, and construction projects, fundamentally altering global economic geography and creating a vast network of international dependencies and supply chains centered on China. However, this rapid, extensive, and often unbalanced economic expansion, while undeniably lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and dramatically improving living standards for many, was not without its significant costs and profound challenges, many of which accumulated over time and became more apparent towards the later part of the Hu Jintao era, 2002 to 2012. The widening gap between the rich and the poor became a major source of social tension, particularly between the prosperous urban and coastal regions and the lagging rural and inland provinces, and between different social groups within cities, like urban residents versus migrant workers, exacerbated by the restrictive hukou household registration system, which limited migrant workers' access to basic public services like education for their children, health care, and pensions in the cities where they lived and worked. Environmental degradation escalated dramatically and reached crisis levels due to unchecked industrial growth, heavy reliance on coal for energy, which accounted for a large percentage of primary energy consumption, and lax environmental regulations and enforcement in the relentless pursuit of economic growth, leading to severe air pollution, smog blanketing major cities and industrial areas, causing significant public health problems and forcing the use of masks, widespread water scarcity and contamination in major rivers, lakes, and groundwater sources, extensive soil degradation and desertification, and rapid resource depletion impacting agricultural productivity and the overall quality of life and health in many areas, becoming a major source of public discontent and environmental protests. Furthermore, rising corruption, fueled by rapid economic growth, vast discretionary power wielded by officials at all levels with little oversight or accountability, and the blurring lines between state power and market opportunities, crony, capitalism, and rent-seeking, became endemic at all levels of government, within state-owned enterprises, and in land development, undermining public trust in government institutions, creating a pervasive sense of unfairness and injustice. The rich get richer through connections, and becoming a major source of public discontent and social unrest, manifesting in thousands of mass incidents or protests annually over issues like illegal land seizures by local officials for lucrative development projects, pollution from factories, labor disputes over unpaid wages or poor working conditions, and official misconduct. The rural-urban divide persisted, with millions of migrant workers facing systemic challenges related to social services, housing, often living in precarious urban villages or factory dormitories, labor rights, facing exploitation, long hours, and dangerous conditions, and full integration into city life, often lacking proper hukou status and facing discrimination. The one-child policy in effect since 1979 continued to impact demographics, leading to an increasingly aging population with a rapidly declining birth rate, a shrinking future workforce relative to the number of retirees, and a severely skewed gender ratio with significantly more males than females, posing long-term challenges for social welfare systems, healthcare, economic growth, as labor costs rise and the dependency ratio increases, and social stability, difficulty finding spouses for millions of men. These challenges represented the accumulating social and environmental costs of prioritizing growth above all else, and the limitations of the existing governance model in addressing complex social issues arising from rapid change. As its economic might grew exponentially and its trade relationships expanded globally, China's international influence expanded significantly and rapidly, moving beyond purely economic engagement to encompass diplomatic, strategic, and cultural dimensions on a global scale. The Go-Out policy, Zuchuk, formally launched in 2000 to encourage Chinese enterprises to invest overseas, became a major driver of China's global expansion. Chinese companies, both large state-owned enterprises like oil companies, construction firms and banks, and increasingly dynamic private firms like Huawei in telecommunications, Lenovo in computers, and later Alibaba and Tencent in tech, began acquiring assets, establishing operations, and investing across the globe, from oil fields and mines in Africa, Latin America, and Australia, to manufacturing plants in Southeast Asia, and technology companies and real estate in Europe and North America. China became a major provider of foreign aid and development assistance, particularly to countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, often in the form of loans tied to infrastructure projects built by Chinese companies, sometimes in exchange for access to vital natural resources or strategic partnerships, leading to a new form of resource diplomacy and accusations of creating debt traps in vulnerable nations, challenging traditional Western aid models, and expanding China's geopolitical footprint and influence. Its soft power initiatives expanded significantly, including the establishment of hundreds of Confucius institutes worldwide, often attached to universities, to promote Chinese language and culture, extensive cultural exchange programs, and increased funding and global expansion for state media outlets like CCTV, Xinhua, China Daily, operating internationally to shape global narratives about China and counter negative reporting. The hosting of the 2008 Beijing Olympics was a spectacular and meticulously choreographed showcase of China's economic achievements, organizational capabilities, technological advancement, and newfound confidence on the world stage, serving as a powerful coming-out party that projected an image of a modern, capable, and confident nation, ready to assume a leading global role and shed its past image of poverty and backwardness. This was followed by the Shanghai World Expo in 2010, further demonstrating its global integration and capacity for hosting large-scale international events and attracting global attention. China also became a more active and assertive participant in international organizations, from the United Nations and its various agencies to the G20 and BRICS group, seeking a greater voice and influence in global governance and the shaping of international norms and rules commensurate with its economic size and growing power, often advocating for the interests of developing nations, simultaneously with its economic expansion and growing diplomatic presence. China embarked on an ambitious and comprehensive program of military modernization, transforming the People's Liberation Army, PLA, from a large, relatively unsophisticated land-centric force focused primarily on defensive operations against potential invasion into a smaller but much more technologically advanced, professional, and capable military, with increasing power projection capabilities across multiple domains. This military expansion was driven by a multifaceted desire to protect its growing economic interests and citizens abroad, as seen in anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden and evacuations of Chinese nationals from conflict zones, secures vital sea lanes and maritime trading routes, like those in the South China Sea and Indian Ocean through which most of its trade and energy imports pass, assert its sovereignty over disputed territories, including islands and reefs in the South and East China Seas and section of its border with India, and project power in the strategically vital Asia-Pacific region to counter perceived U.S. influence and presence and ensure its regional dominance. The PLA Navy plan underwent rapid expansion and modernization, developing a modern fleet of destroyers, frigates, corvettes, advanced submarines, including nuclear-powered ones, amphibious assault ships, and launching its first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, a refitted Soviet vessel, in 2012, followed by its first domestically built carrier, the Shandong, in 2019, with more under construction, signaling a shift towards becoming a blue water navy. The PLA Air Force, PLAAF, developed stealth fighter programs, J-20, J-31, advanced bombers, and a modern transport and reconnaissance fleet. The PLA Rocket Force developed an arsenal of advanced ballistic and cruise missiles, including intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting targets across Asia, and anti-ship ballistic missiles like the DF-21D, nicknamed Carrier Killer, designed to target moving aircraft carriers at long range, a potential asymmetric counter to U.S. naval power. This military buildup, particularly in naval and air power, raised concerns among neighboring countries and the United States. Territorial disputes, particularly in the South China Sea, where China asserts expansive and controversial claims over vast maritime areas, the 9-dash line, encompassing major shipping lanes, rich fishing grounds, and potential energy reserves, and has engaged in extensive island building and militarization of artificial islands and reefs with runways and military facilities. And over Taiwan, which Beijing views as an inalienable renegade province destined for eventual reunification with the mainland, by force if necessary, if peaceful means fail, became increasingly prominent and volatile on the international agenda, raising regional tensions and drawing significant concern and opposition from neighboring countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and the United States, who view China's assertive actions as destabilizing and contrary to international law, as ruled by a 2016 international tribunal regarding the South China Sea, which China rejected. China also invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities, including advanced cyber warfare units, sophisticated space programs, including its own Beidou satellite navigation system, challenging the U.S. GPS, and a growing network of reconnaissance and communication satellites, as well as crewed space missions and its own space station, and anti-satellite weapons, signaling a broader strategic ambition to challenge U.S. military and technological dominance in these critical domains and develop capabilities to deny potential adversaries access to crucial operational spheres. In 2012, Xi Jinping assumed the leadership of the Communist Party as General Secretary and Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and later State President in 2013, ushering in a new and distinct era characterized by a more assertive, confident, and centralized China on the global stage, coupled with an intensified tightening of internal control, ideological conformity, and a renewed emphasis on the party's central and absolute role in all aspects of national life. He articulated the grand vision of the Chinese dream, Zhongguoming, a broad and aspirational concept encompassing national rejuvenation and the restoration of China to a position of historical greatness and global leadership, the achievement of a moderately prosperous society for all, Shaokang Society, initially targeted for 2021, and the establishment of a strong modern military capable of defending national interests and projecting power globally. This dream resonated deeply with the Chinese populace, tapping into a long-held desire to overcome the humiliations of the past century and restore China's rightful place in the world. One of Xi's signature and most impactful initiatives was a sweeping, unprecedented, and sustained anti-corruption campaign, launched immediately upon taking power, which targeted officials at all levels, from low-ranking flies to high-ranking tigers, including senior party and military leaders. While immensely popular with the public for addressing a pervasive grievance and restoring some measure of trust and legitimacy in the party, this campaign also strategically served to consolidate his power by systematically removing potential rivals, loyalizing the party ranks, and centralizing decision-making authority under his leadership, dismantling rival power networks built by previous leaders. This campaign brought down numerous high-ranking officials, including former Politburo Standing Committee member Zhou Yongkang, a move that broke with previous unwritten rules about the inviolability of top leaders, signaling Xi's determination to brook no opposition to his authority. Xi also moved to strengthen party control over state institutions, SOEs, universities, cultural organizations, and the media, emphasizing ideological discipline and loyalty. A cornerstone of Xi Jinping's ambitious foreign policy and economic strategy is the colossal Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, also known as the Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, launched in 2013. This ambitious global infrastructure development project aims to revive and expand ancient Silk Road trade routes and create new economic corridors across continents, connecting China with vast swathes of Asia, Europe, Africa, and even parts of Oceania and Latin America through an immense network of roads, railways, ports, pipelines, power grids, telecommunications networks, and digital infrastructure. The BRI is not merely an economic undertaking focused on trade, facilitation, and investment. It is a profound and multifaceted geopolitical strategy meticulously designed to enhance China's connectivity and leverage, expand its influence across continents through economic interdependence, secure vital supply chains for resources and markets, create new markets and outlets for Chinese goods, services, and construction capabilities, addressing domestic industrial overcapacity, and project its economic and strategic power globally, fundamentally altering the global economic and political landscape and creating a China-centered network of infrastructure and trade. It involves hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and loans in partner countries, funding the construction of ports in countries like Pakistan, Gwadar, Sri Lanka, Hambantota, and Greece, Piraeus, high-speed railways in Laos and Indonesia, oil and gas pipelines in Central Asia, industrial parks across Asia and Africa, and digital infrastructure projects. While proponents highlight its potential for economic development, job creation, and improved connectivity in participating countries, particularly developing nations that lack infrastructure funding, critics, particularly in the West, and some recipient countries express serious concerns about potential debt traps, for recipient nations unable to repay potentially unsustainable loans, adverse environmental impact from large infrastructure projects, lack of transparency in contracting, bidding, and project selection processes, and China's growing strategic leverage and influence over sovereign states through economic means, raising questions about geopolitical intentions, debt sustainability, and the true nature of the partnerships, viewing it partly as a tool for projecting Chinese power and influence. Domestically, Xi Jinping's administration has placed an unprecedented emphasis on achieving technological self-sufficiency and fostering indigenous innovation, particularly in strategic sectors deemed critical for national security, economic competitiveness, and insulating China from foreign pressure and potential supply chain disruptions or technology restrictions, especially from the United States. The Made in China 2025 initiative, announced in 2015 for instance, explicitly aims to comprehensively upgrade China's industrial base, shifting away from low-end, labor-intensive manufacturing towards high-tech, advanced industries such as artificial intelligence, robotics, aerospace, new energy vehicles, advanced materials, biotechnology, integrated circuits, semiconductors, and information technology. This ambitious strategy seeks to drastically reduce China's reliance on foreign technology, particularly from the United States and other Western nations, and establish it as a global leader and innovator in critical advanced manufacturing sectors, moving decisively up the global value chain and reducing vulnerability to external coercion. Investment in research and development has soared under state direction, with China now spending more on R&D as a percentage of GDP than many developed nations, and its output of scientific papers, patents, and PhDs is rapidly increasing, particularly in STEM fields. China has rapidly become a major innovator and market leader in areas like 5G telecommunications technology, led by companies like Huawei, e-commerce platforms like Alibaba, JD.com, Pinduoduo, digital payment systems, Alipay, WeChat Pay, artificial intelligence applications, and renewable energy technology, solar panels, wind turbines, demonstrating its formidable capacity for technological advancement and its explicit ambition to lead the fourth industrial revolution and become a science and technology superpower. By 2049, however, the Xi Jinping era has also seen a significant and pervasive tightening of state and party control over all aspects of society, the economy, and information, reversing some of the earlier trends towards greater openness, intellectual freedom, and relative social space that emerged during the Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao eras. Internet censorship has intensified dramatically, with the Great Firewall becoming more robust, sophisticated, and pervasive, utilizing advanced technology and increased personnel to strictly limit access to foreign websites, control the flow of information within the country, and meticulously monitor and censor online discourse to suppress dissent, critical voices, discussions of politically sensitive topics, and content deemed harmful to party rule or social stability. The development and partial implementation of a comprehensive social credit system, still under development, but with pilot programs in place in various cities and industries, which monitors and evaluates the behavior of individuals, businesses, and government entities, has raised profound concerns both domestically and internationally about privacy, individual freedoms, and the extent of state surveillance, control, and social engineering, potentially leading to a dystopian future where access to services, jobs, travel, and opportunities depends on state-assigned scores based on monitored behavior. In regions like Xinjiang, the government's policies towards ethnic minorities, particularly the Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim Turkic minorities, have drawn widespread and intense international condemnation, with credible reports from academic researchers, investigative journalists, and former detainees detailing mass detention camps, euphemistically called vocational training centers, where hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million, Uyghurs and other minorities have been held without trial, subjected to political indoctrination, forced labor, forced sterilization, and systematic cultural and religious suppression aimed at forcibly assimilating these groups into Han Chinese culture and ensuring their absolute loyalty to the party state, leading to accusations of crimes against humanity and even genocide by some international bodies, governments, including the U.S., and human rights organizations. In Hong Kong, after large-scale pro-democracy protests erupted in 2019 against an extradition bill and for greater autonomy, the central government, bypassing the city's legislature, imposed a sweeping national security law in 2020 which has significantly curtailed the city's long-cherished autonomy promised under the One Country, Two Systems framework, severely restricting civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and the independence of the legal system, leading to widespread arrests of pro-democracy activists, politicians, journalists, and the closure of independent media outlets, and a further deterioration of relations with Western democracies, effectively dismantling the high degree of autonomy and eroding its status as a global financial hub based on the rule of law, the relationship between China and the United States, the world's two largest economies, two largest military spenders, and most powerful nations, has become increasingly complex, competitive, and at times overtly confrontational, often described as a new Cold War, a strategic competition, or a rivalry for global dominance. What began as a targeted trade war under the Trump administration in 2018, involving escalating tariffs aimed at addressing trade imbalances and what the U.S. saw as unfair trade practices, quickly expanded into a broader strategic rivalry encompassing nearly every dimension of international relations: technology, with restrictions placed on Chinese tech companies like Huawei and TikTok, and export controls on advanced semiconductors; intellectual property rights, with persistent accusations of large-scale theft; cybersecurity, with accusations of state-sponsored hacking for espionage and economic gain; human rights, over Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and political freedoms; supply chain resilience, efforts by the U.S. and allies to reduce reliance on China; and geopolitical influence across the globe. The U.S. now largely views China as its primary strategic competitor and long-term adversary, a revisionist power challenging its long-standing global leadership and the liberal international order established after World War II, while China perceives U.S. actions as a deliberate attempt to contain its inevitable rise, thwart its national rejuvenation, prevent its return to a position of global prominence, and maintain American hegemony, viewing them as a continuation of historical Western aggression and a zero-sum game for global power and influence. This intensifying competition has led to increased tensions in sensitive areas like the South China Sea, where both nations conduct naval operations and freedom of navigation exercises, over the sensitive issue of Taiwan, with Beijing increasing military pressure and activity near the island, the U.S. increasing arms sales to Taiwan and reaffirming security commitments and strong rhetoric from Beijing about eventual reunification, by force if peaceful means fail. And in the crucial technological sphere, with both nations vying fiercely for supremacy in critical emerging technologies like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnologies, leading to a tech war involving export controls, investment screening, and efforts to decouple certain sectors. The competition extends to international institutions and global governance, with both powers seeking to shape the future world order, influence global norms and standards, and build alliances and partnerships, creating a more fractured and polarized international system. The COVID-19 pandemic, which originated in Wuhan, China, in late 2019, presented an unprecedented global health and economic challenge and profoundly impacted China's domestic stability, social contract, and international standing. China's initial response, including a strict lockdown of Wuhan and surrounding Hubei province, aggressive contact tracing, and extensive containment measures, was initially praised by some within China and internationally for its apparent effectiveness in controlling the initial outbreak within its borders, albeit at a significant human cost in terms of civil liberties and economic activity in Wuhan itself. However, its subsequent adoption and rigid implementation of a zero-COVID policy from early 2020 onwards, which involved extensive mandatory mass testing for vast populations, prolonged mandatory quarantines for travelers and close contacts, often in centralized facilities, and frequent, sweeping citywide or district-wide lockdowns, sometimes lasting for weeks or months, as seen in major cities like Shanghai in 2022, imposed immense economic and social costs, disrupted domestic economic activity, led to widespread public frustration, protests, and significantly impacted global supply chains dependent on Chinese production. This rigid policy was eventually abandoned abruptly in December 2022, following rare widespread public protests against the severity of the restrictions and mounting economic pressure. The sudden pivot led to a massive wave of infections and deaths across the country in early 2023 as the virus spread unchecked through a population with limited natural immunity due to the long lockdowns and relatively low vaccination rates among the elderly. The pandemic also starkly highlighted the interconnectedness of the global economy and the profound, far-reaching impact of events in one country on the rest of the world, underscoring China's central role in global supply chains and its influence on global health. The origins of the virus and China's transparency, or lack thereof, in the early days of the outbreak, also became a point of intense international contention and geopolitical mistrust, particularly with the United States and many Western nations, fueling demands for independent investigations. Looking ahead, China faces a complex array of interconnected challenges and immense opportunities that will define its future trajectory in the coming decades. Economically, it grapples with a structurally slowing growth rate after decades of hypergrowth, an increasingly aging population with one of the lowest total fertility rates in the world, a projected shrinking workforce in the coming years relative to the number of retirees, and a significant level of local government and corporate debt, particularly concentrated in the property sector, with major developers facing potential default and systemic risk. The ambitious and necessary shift from an export-driven, investment-heavy economic model reliant on manufacturing and infrastructure spending to one more reliant on domestic consumption, services, and indigenous innovation, the dual circulation strategy, emphasizing building a strong internal market while remaining open internationally, is a long-term, arduous structural transformation that requires fundamental changes to income distribution, social safety nets, and the role of the state in the economy. Geopolitically, China's relationship with the United States and other Western powers remains strained and contentious, characterized by a delicate and often precarious mix of limited cooperation on certain global issues like climate change, pandemics, and financial stability, and intense, multifaceted competition across virtually all domains, from trade and technology to ideology, values, and regional influence. Its rapidly growing military capabilities and increasingly assertive foreign policy, coupled with expanding global interests, like those protected by the BRI, continue to reshape the regional and global security landscape, prompting re-evaluations of alliances, defense spending, and strategic postures worldwide, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The future of Taiwan remains a critical and potentially dangerous flashpoint, with Beijing increasing diplomatic and military pressure on the island, raising concerns about the potential for conflict with catastrophic global economic and human consequences. Internally, the Communist Party faces the ongoing monumental challenge of maintaining social stability, national unity, and legitimacy in a rapidly changing, more educated, urbanized, and increasingly diverse society with rising expectations and awareness of global norms. This includes addressing persistent income inequality and regional disparities, while the Common Prosperity Initiative aims to tackle wealth gaps. Implementation faces significant challenges, mitigating severe environmental degradation and transitioning to a cleaner, greener economy, requiring massive investments in renewable energy and environmental protection, but still relying heavily on coal. Managing the demands of a more educated, connected, and globally aware populace with rising expectations for better governance, social services, and quality of life, and adapting to profound demographic shifts. The delicate and ever-evolving balance between rigid state and party control and dynamic market vitality, between national security imperatives and the aspirations for individual freedoms, civil liberties, and rule of law, will remain a defining tension within Chinese society and a key challenge for the party's governance. The party's ability to adapt to these complex internal and external pressures, maintain its legitimacy and absolute control while navigating complex global dynamics and ensuring continued economic development and social progress, will be crucial for China's future and its profound impact on the world. China's trajectory in the coming decades will undoubtedly shape the very future of the world, profoundly influencing global trade patterns, technological advancements, international norms, geopolitical stability, and the evolving international order itself. From the revolutionary zeal and ideological fervor of Mao Zedong, who unified the nation, built the foundations of the socialist state, and sought to create a new man through the pragmatic economic reforms and gradual opening up initiated by Deng Xiaoping, which transformed China into an economic powerhouse and lifted millions out of poverty. And now to the assertive global ambitions and tighter internal control under Xi Jinping, who seeks to restore China to a position of global leadership and secure the party's long-term rule. China's journey has been one of relentless, often tumultuous, and truly transformative change. It is a complex, dynamic, and multifaceted story that continues to unfold with profound, far-reaching implications for every corner of our interconnected planet, demanding our continued attention, critical analysis, and nuanced understanding. Thank you for joining me on this extensive, detailed, and comprehensive exploration of China's remarkable and multifaceted rise from a war-torn, impoverished nation to a modern economic and global power. I sincerely hope this in-depth journey through its pivotal historical periods, transformative policies, and ongoing challenges has provided you with a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of the powerful forces that have shaped this extraordinary nation and continue to define its trajectory. If you found substantial value in this in-depth video, the historical narrative, and the analysis presented, please consider giving it a thumbs up, sharing it with others who might find this subject matter interesting and informative, and most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more detailed and analytical content on history, geopolitics, and global affairs. Your engagement, comments, and support are invaluable and truly fuel this channel, enabling me to continue researching and bringing you more fascinating historical and geopolitical analyses in the future. Until next time, take care and keep exploring.